Hello, and welcome to the first of a three-part podcast series on survey methods with Ipsos UK and the Office for National Statistics. I'm Tom Huskinson, head of the Survey Research Method Centre at Ipsos UK, and today we're going to be talking about how we can use a respondent-centred design approach when developing surveys, and specifically how we can use this approach for surveys with different budgets and different time constraints via three levels of respondent-centred design: bronze, silver, and gold. So today I'm very pleased to be joined by Laura Wilson, who is Principal Research Officer at the Office for National Statistics and Data Collection Lead at the UK Government Data Quality Hub, and also by Charlie Hales. Charlie is also a Principal Research Officer at the Office for National Statistics and is Harmonisation Lead for the Government Statistical Service. Both Laura and Charlie have worked extensively on developing approaches to ensure respondents are placed at the heart of survey design. And Laura's co-authored the book Respondent Centred Surveys, Stop, Listen and Then Design, which was published in 2022. So a very warm welcome to you both, Laura and Charlie.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for being here. So I think, first of all, Laura, if I could turn to you, it would be really useful if you could just explain to us briefly what respondent-centred design's all about and how it differs from the more kind of traditional approaches to designing and delivering surveys some people may be more familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. So RCD is really all about putting the respondent at the heart of survey design. And if that's the only thing you remember, then that's great. But basically, it means involving the respondent at every stage of the development. So that's right the way through from the letter through to the questionnaire. And it's about developing content around their needs and their mental models, which are basically about how they perceive the world around them. So that's kind of how the approach mainly differs from traditional survey design. I guess in contrast, traditional design can be very orientated around the data user and their needs. So, for example, using terms that they'd suggest maybe for question wording versus words that the respondent might use themselves in every day, so to speak. And then also maybe suggesting the order and flow of the questionnaire, which could clash with how the respondent would like to have those question topics presented to them. It mainly involves a lot of pre-design research to learn about respondents' needs, and then this is then used to inform the designs that we mock up and run in testing activities then. And RCD also combines usability and cognitive testing in the same session, and that's to really maximise those results, whereas maybe in more traditional development, you would do those things separately. And just to say, there is actually a 10-point framework which is available online to sort of step you through the RCDF and the different types of aspects and components of respondent-centred design.
So you mentioned they're using both usability and cognitive testing. Can you tell us a little bit about how these approaches work together? Some people may think of them as quite distinct, but in RCD, how are they used in conjunction with each other?
Yeah, so usually you do one type of testing and then maybe do the other type separately. However, we found in our work that it's really important to test the two things together during the same session, really. So, and this is because the look and feel can really affect interpretation as much as the question design and the wording themselves. So, for example, the placement of the help information may influence whether it's seen and used or not, and even things like the shape of the radio button can be indicative to respondents about whether they need to select one response or they can select multiple options. So when doing this sort of testing, you can also use behavioural coding, and that can help by noting down behaviours that are linked to usability and cognition, and also probing around both of those aspects when the respondent is struggling, as this really ensures you pick up on the true cause of the problem. So what we don't want to do in this type of testing is to make a change to a question which is actually due to a usability problem and not due to a cognitive issue. So it's really about trying to get to the core of the problem, and that's why doing the two things together in the same session is really, really useful.
Yeah, and there might be some researchers who are familiar with other frameworks and approaches to developing surveys. So, there are the government design principles, which were developed back in 2012, I think, and those have certain principles that, start with user needs, do less is one of them, iterate and then iterate again is another. The respondent-centred design framework, that's more recent, but how would you say it relates to other frameworks like these government design principles? Is it quite different, or is there a lot of crossover between the two?
So the Gov Design principles are fantastic. We actually used to have them printed up in the wall when we were back in the office, and they really inspired us in our work and helped us to align our work to ensure they were respondent centred. So the principles in RCD are definitely aligned. For example, you could actually take them and nest them amongst each other, so they should actually fit really nicely, and you can demonstrate how one aspect of the RCDF could fit then with one of the items in the design principles. But basically you can use them together, and I tend to think of it as the principles share the ethos and the how you should be working, and then the RCDF is a bit more practical and a bit more actionable, and it tells you basically what you could be doing to achieve those things within the framework then. And I guess just to mention that because I think in the past some people have struggled to link together some of the Gov UK service design principles and linking them to surveys. So more recently we have developed some survey specific design principles as well, which do really nicely lay over the Gov UK ones and integrate some of the RCDF components as well. So we can share those in links from this podcast.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's useful to hear that these things are kind of harmonized with each other rather than being conflicting, certainly. So, I mean, I think if we move on to the guidance you recently published, I think it was earlier this year in May, you published some guidance called the 3 levels of respondent centred design. So this is online on the government analysis function web pages. We'll also include a link to it in the notes to this podcast. And essentially it presents 3 different levels of respondent centred design, termed bronze, silver and gold. So Charlie, if I could turn to you, could you tell us a little bit about what led you to create this guidance? How did the guidance come about?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the question design space for quite some time at the Office for National Statistics, ONS, and was fortunate enough to eventually be in a position where I was leading and managing a team that was responsible for redesigning questions for a large voluntary survey. And one of the frequent conversations I had with internal stakeholders was always, how do we do this more quickly? Can we move the date to the left? But, you know, when we're talking about designing questions or survey materials, if we do it more quickly, it gets quite risky. So it was a lot of the same conversations with different people. You know, if we do it well, it will take X amount of time. If we do a light touch redesign, it will be quicker, but at risk of X, Y, Z. And this was kind of coupled with RCD being relatively new for surveys, and the approaches taken weren't always well understood across our office because it is, you know, it is kind of new. So it was developed to use with stakeholders to help them make better informed decisions on the work, and also it was a really good practical tool that could be used by other teams across the office and now externally because it's on the analysis function website. So for example, in there we've got different research methods that you can do at those different agile stages of development.
And what can people expect from this guidance?
So we've created the guidance to outline different levels of RCD that can be completed to design survey questions and materials, like we said. And each level of RCD, the gold, silver and bronze, all carry their own associated risks. So it's about allowing the survey owners and commissioners and suppliers to make those informed decisions about how much to allocate to their research and design activities and where they're comfortable with the amount of risk they're willing to take on. So in a nutshell, the gold level is the gold standard. It carries minimal risk to the survey and is fully aligned to that RCD framework and the GDS design principles. Of course, this level of work does take the longest. That's one of the things to think about with that. The silver level is definitely that middle ground of risk and the amount of RCD work completed. In silver, the focus is on developing an online question mode and then drawing on this to design other modes from the survey, such as the interviewer-led modes like telephone or face-to-face if you need them. It's obviously quicker than gold, but carries more risk. And of course, we've got the bronze level of RCD, which would be the minimal work and research completed on those questions and materials, but obviously carrying that maximum risk with it. So it would be a minimal discovery agile period with no prototype testing in alpha and no beta improvements either. So quite short to do, and this level does allow us to respond rapidly to emerging needs such as the global pandemic. So we're not saying don't ever use it, just be considerate of those risks that go alongside. And the final thing is we have included the unvalidated development approach as well. This approach has no main RCD activities such as mental model research.
Sure, and this guidance, it kind of goes into a certain amount of detail in the 3 levels. And, for a researcher that's thinking of heading over and having a look at it, is there something they should know before? Should they familiarise themselves with anything before they go ahead and look at this in terms of kind of understanding the fundamentals?
Yeah, so we did try to make the guidance as comprehensive as possible, but obviously we want to keep it engaging and not too long. So the guidance, it doesn't really detail how to conduct different research methods. So if you're on the side of doing the research, some knowledge in that area would be useful. Having said that, as Laura has said, we do have plenty of additional guidance on the analysis function site. For example, the survey development toolkit, that's there as well. If you are on the stakeholder owner side of the survey, reflecting on the risks in the guidance, having your knowledge and context of the code of practice is useful. And finally, the other thing we'll say is, if you have a rough idea of your project's timings and resources before kind of maybe committing to one of those levels of respondent centred design, just to help you plan more effectively, would be useful as well.
Sure. Okay. So, if we think you've given us a useful summary of the 3 levels, but if we think of them in a little more detail, perhaps if we maybe kind of think of gold, as you say, it's the gold standard. Can you tell us a little bit about the stages involved in gold, maybe a bit of what timelines we might be looking at, what kind of instances we might be looking to use that?
Yeah, of course. So like I said, gold is the gold standard. So the maximum investment in design and learning from your respondents' needs. And with it, of course, there is plenty of testing to do, so a lot of work to do. It does carry that minimal risk to quality of a survey, fully aligned to the RCD framework and the GDS principles, like I said. In a nutshell, not to get too much into the weeds because that's all online, you can go read it. A gold standard would be a really thorough discovery stage where you're really getting to the bottom of the stakeholder needs, how the respondents think about things. And in the alpha stage, there would be at least 3 rounds of cognitive interviewing per mode for that survey. So for example, you could start with the online mode, and then there would also be at least 3 tests for telephone, face-to-face, paper, whatever your survey mode is. And the length of time for a gold approach is also kind of dependent on the experience of your researchers and how comfortable they are with these methods, and also the number of researchers that you have as well. So if you have more researchers, some of those survey modes can be run kind of concurrently if we're comfortable to do that. But ideally, you would have 1 senior researcher and 2 to 3 junior researchers working on this. Timelines, as a rough guide, your timings for this, so we have worked out it would be just over a year, we think, so about 65 weeks. Obviously, if you have multiple researchers who are experienced, you could condense down to 47 weeks. But a really big caveat to that timeline is that these timings are primarily based on our ways of working at ONS, because that is obviously what we know. So for example, we always give 2 weeks to conduct those interviews. For your work, you might get them all done in a week or maybe even a couple of days, or it could be a bit longer. So it is important to reflect on on that and what is available to you when you're presenting this approach to your stakeholders.
Sure, yeah. And from looking at it, it certainly seems that kind of thinking primarily about what needs to be done is more important than just thinking this is how long we've got. So, if we now think about silver, so, not quite at the level of gold, but, still thorough, what are the main differences with silver, and how does it compare to gold?
Yeah, so silver carries a medium level of risk to quality due to the amount of RCD work being reduced. So as we have risk increasing, the RCD activities decrease, so they do kind of play off one another. I would say the main difference to gold is doing less research, so less learning and testing. In alpha, I think is where the main difference lies. So instead of a minimum of 3 test rounds per mode, you would do 2 rounds of cognitive interviewing per round. And actually in beta, you would only look to run maybe 1 quantitative test. So quite reduced on the activities. And with gold, similar. For silver, the length of time will vary depending on the researcher's experience and the numbers on the project. But roughly, you could be looking at 22 to 24 weeks for this, and that's with 1 senior researcher and 2 junior researchers. So we're getting less and less.
Sure. Okay. And obviously the last one being a bronze, but no means the least. How does bronze differ from silver?
Yeah, so the bronze level then is carrying the maximum risk to quality of the 3 due to that heavy reduction in RCD work. And there is obviously less alignment to the GDS principles as well, because, iterate is more difficult to do in bronze. So in alpha for bronze, there can be 1 round of cog interviewing per mode and no beta activities. And, like the other 2, length of time depends on your researcher's experience, but roughly we think around 15 to 21 weeks for this development, and that would be with 1 researcher, 1 staff member. So 1 senior researcher, or you could have 1 experienced junior researcher doing that. Sure.
Okay, so that's gold, silver, bronze. And then you mentioned earlier about the unvalidated development approach. So this is where surveys development, so it doesn't include a discovery phase or research into the respondent mental models. But, some people will find themselves in a situation where they need to feel something in a certain amount of time, and they might go down an unvalidated development route. So, Laura, if I could turn to you, could you tell us a little bit about this unvalidated development approach? Are there instances where it's perfectly defensible, possibly even preferable to use this sort of approach?
Yeah, sure. So the unvalidated approach is the one which carries overall the highest risks to quality and to respondent experience, basically. And this is because it doesn't include any primary research and testing. So instead, designs are really being created relying on people's expertise alone. And we tend to call this at-desk design. And this is risky because even the most experienced questionnaires designers get it wrong. So even as experts, they don't have this innate knowledge about how different parts of society will respond to or interpret questions. And, they only grow that knowledge through direct research and testing over time themselves. So it's really important, obviously, to have that first-hand experience and to build on it. So this at-desk design, you can create questions from it, but there are risks obviously associated with it. However, we've all designed in this way at some point in our careers, and I'll put my hand up there and say I have as well. And, be that due to time, cost, resource challenges, or all 3 in some situations. So don't feel too bad about it. But, there are times when it is the right thing to do. So, for example, I had to work in this way during the pandemic when designing some of the rapid response questions that we had on the opinion survey. And those sorts of circumstances really warrant it, because ultimately, if we had taken a gold approach, by the time the organisation had the data, it would have been far too late, and it would have been out of date, and the decisions made wouldn't have been useful from it. So, those are the types of circumstances where, rapid data needs are suited to this sort of approach, basically. But just to say, it can be used, but it is the non-preferred approach, as obviously we always want to do that primary research and get that evidence to inform the design of our surveys.
So it's certainly very useful to know that the guidance isn't just aimed at those with kind of years disposal for development, and it does have someone for everyone depending on their budgets and timelines. So I think if we're coming towards the end now, so I think if just a very general question to wrap up, really, I'd like to ask you each what you think the main piece of advice that you would give to someone who's starting work designing a survey using Respondent Centred Design framework. What would be the main piece of advice you'd give them, Laura?
So my book co-author, Emma Dickinson, and I have delivered quite a few training courses on RCD and the framework now, and we regularly get asked, what if I can't do it all? And that's for lots of different reasons, resource, whatever. So we get it, it does seem quite overwhelming. It's something that's new. But our advice is to really just do what you can. So even if you can only do certain elements of the components, or if you need to build it up over time, then that's a step in the right direction and it's a really good start. I think the other thing I'd sort of recommend is that you really try your best to include that mental model phase and that discovery phase and not skip it entirely. So there is the temptation to sort of stop doing any pre-research and actually go straight to mocking up the designs and then going out to testing. But from our experience, when we actually do that discovery phase, we kind of future-proof the designs into the testing phase. So you actually may need to do less testing rounds because you've actually done that pre-work in advance. So try your best to retain that discovery phase and that mental model piece of research if you can.
Great. And Charlie, what's your main piece of advice?
So I think as much as you can, remove your own assumptions from the work. So being in this design space, I hear so many times, I wouldn't have asked a question like that, or this reminder letter for a survey. Does that bit in the paragraph actually work? When actually the survey questions and materials should be driven by what the respondents think. So it's their mental model. So actually the answers to those questions would be, okay, our research shows that, X, Y, Z, because assumption-led design is obviously a very real thing. And as Laura said, no matter how much experience you have at doing respondent-centred design, how many survey questions you developed in the past, designing behind closed doors will most likely deliver you a product that doesn't work for your respondents. And it's not about what you think works and your preconceived ideas to the solution. It's all navigated by the respondents. And I've actually got a phrase that I use quite a bit, and I think it's quite relevant here as well. I always say stakeholders tell you what to design, respondents tell you how to design it and ask it, basically. So it's our job as researchers to keep refocusing that attention on the respondents and their perspectives.
Sure, and it's interesting to hear about the danger of making assumptions, because not so long ago I had experience designing a question where I didn't think anything could be wrong with the question. It was asking parents how many children they've got in their household at the ages of the children, with an open numeric box. And in usability testing, we found that parents with children aged under 1 would want to type in 6 months or 10 weeks, because that's how they thought about the age of their child. And it didn't occur to them that actually they'd enter the number 0. So no one ever thought that could possibly be problematic, but then we ended up changing it to a list with an option for under 1. So it kind of highlights the dangers of making assumptions and exploring these mental models, as you say. Well, that's all we got time for today. So thank you very much to you, Laura and Charlie, for such an informative and interesting discussion. And to those listening, please do look out for the second and third podcasts in the 3-part survey methods series between Ipsos UK and the Office for National Statistics. In the second podcast, we're going to be taking a look at agile survey development approaches. And then in the third one, we'll be taking a look at how we can ensure that we design our surveys to be inclusive and accessible. So thank you again, Laura and Charlie, and thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.